Only for today.
Just cold. Sir, can you tell us about the layoffs first?
Yes.
Where will these things land? Are these actual people going out the door? Are these positions?
So there are some 230 positions. We can move things around in terms of vacancies, in terms of pending retirements and so on, but you're still going to see some 100 people lose their positions.
And do you know where that will happen? What areas? What departments?
It is proportionate to where you see some of the service reductions in what we passed today. I really can't go into any more detail than that because it would be a little bit too identifiable.
Timeframes?
Soonish. The key is that the cuts that we made today are effective for the rest of the year. So we'll have to see those service reductions happen quite quickly or we will not be able to achieve the savings for the rest of the year.
Can you talk about the transit cuts?
Yeah, sure. So the majority of the cuts to transit are cuts in management, but also in how we do deployment and so on. But there is a cut of about 88,000 transit hours. I don't believe that there are any routes being canceled, but you are going to see a little bit more spacing between trains and buses, particularly in off-peak hours. But to put that into context, we increased the service for 2019 by more than that. However, people will see a real impact because remember we have to absorb this in only one quarter of the year. So people will see an impact to service. However, that service is mostly in the frequency of the service. It's not in routes being changed or cut.
There was also some changes made on the fly here. Are we closing 2 city pools?
I'm glad you noticed that. So in recreation, there was a discussion about closing a couple of fitness facilities. And of all the cuts in the package, it was felt that that particular one needed a little more thought. Recreation will have to absorb that $800,000 cut. But what council agreed to do is to fund up to $800,000 until the end of the year to really look at the operating model to make sure that recreation facilities are available equitably throughout the city and so on. So that is a long way of saying there'll be more information on that particular one. What council really did was they said, let's delay that and figure out what the right service reduction in recreation is.
Can you name the pools?
Not at this time.
So is it a $59 million cut package?
No. So council approved the cut,
Yeah.
but they put in a little bit of one-time money just to cover the amount of that cut through the end of the year. This is important to remember, that the cuts are permanent. So they're permanent to the base. So it'll be $60 million every year going forward. In that particular case, council put in enough money to keep that particular service operating until the end of the year, but that permanent cut still exists.
For the fire department, is this change going to be noticeable in terms of the response that people would see when they need help?
They'll see a different vehicle. So if you called 911 because you were having a medical emergency, for the last few years, you might have seen kind of a Chevy Suburban show up at your door that said Calgary Fire on it with 2 trained firefighters in it who could help with emergency life-saving work. Now you'll see a fire truck, not that vehicle. That sounds a bit trite, but that's actually the change that's been made. We had a pilot project to run emergency medical response with firefighters using different kinds of vehicles, and we will be ending that program.
Does that not cost more to run a larger vehicle to my house instead of a Suburban?
You have fewer people operating within a fire hall. It's just a different model. The thing is, though, that the firefighters are all well trained in life-saving techniques, and they will get there. So yes, it might cost a few more pennies than gasoline because it's a larger vehicle, but it's really about the staffing and deployment model where the savings come from.
When you say you take no joy in this, I mean, it's probably never easy to, have somebody told that their job is being cut. But what were you getting at? What were you referencing?
Well, listen, I do take no joy in this. We have to continue to provide quality services to people, and administration did a great job on following those 2 core principles. Do as little harm as possible, treat employees with dignity and respect. That said, as I've said before, council had many options to deal with this small business tax shift. Many of those options would have helped the small businesses to a very similar extent that we are helping them without requiring mid-year tax cuts. We can't do this again. As we work to make government more efficient, we've saved $660 million now in cuts. We have to do so in a thoughtful, planned, methodical way that preserves the services people want, not giving people a month to cut 5% of the budget.
There's gonna be some city employees tomorrow morning when we wake up to read there's gonna be 115 less jobs at the city. And a lot of them are gonna go, but this happened the day after council has said they're gonna entertain a new arena deal. What do you have to say to those people?
You know, as I've said before, the timing stinks, and it's cold comfort for me to say, but it's true that these are different processes. We have to continue to work to help government be more efficient, but we also have to invest in the future. And yes, they're completely different pots of money, and yes, we think about them very differently, but ultimately, of course, it's true that the juxtaposition of these things is difficult. But the other thing we have to remember is that we're investing in things that will improve the downtown core. We're investing in things that will help our structural problems and will ultimately help solve the problem that we're trying to fix with these cuts. So I know that's a bit round, but the point is that if we stop doing that, then we would see a future only of more cuts.
Do you feel that this discussion has kind of made galvanized council to consider more long-term solutions for the
Well, we were always considering long-term solutions, and that's the thing that has been perhaps misrepresented. The long-term solutions actually don't solve the problem of the 5,000 businesses today. So if we had done a complete shift in 1 year, as some people were proposing, people who would have seen, we had one person say they had a $3,000 increase per month in their taxes. Well, they would have seen a $2,700 increase in their taxes. I bet they still would have been on the steps of City Hall, but we would have spent all the money that we now have spent to help them. So it's really important to understand, yes, the structural shift needs to happen, but it actually doesn't solve today's problem. And we have to be able to look at short-term solutions and structural solutions together, but do not believe anyone who says, oh, if only businesses paid 3 instead of 4 to 1, the problem would be solved. It would not.
What impact did the public hearings have today on the bottom line?
Ultimately, council passed what administration had proposed. But I think what was not made clear before the public hearings is that administration's number one principle was do no harm, or not do no harm, minimize the harm, and particularly minimize the harm to our most vulnerable citizens. They were already operating on that principle, and that was really the shame about the whole conversation that's been going on the last couple of weeks, because I think that was lost.
Okay, guys, last question.
But when you have cuts in affordable housing, youth employment services, are you not hurting vulnerable people?
Let's keep in mind that when we look at those are cuts that are not to direct services people use every day. So for example, on affordable housing, actually I think it was my proposal, we put in a program to waive a lot of city fees for the construction of affordable housing programs, affordable housing units, and that's really what was scaled back today a little bit, but that also matches the number of units being built. And so, there may be mythical units that are not yet being proposed that would not have access to those waived permit fees, but that's not really hurting people who need affordable housing today, if that makes sense. Similarly, there's still a youth employment center. It'll be staffed on a different model, but we also know that young people who are looking for work are using technology in different ways to look for work.
But she said there will be more cuts. Is that realistic?
I think what we need to do is continue to foster the culture of continuous improvement we've seen at the city, and make sure that we're finding better ways to deliver services, whether that's using technology, whether that's doing things in a different way. That has to go on continuously. But I wouldn't characterize that as knee-jerk cuts, and that's what I hope we will not see going forward.